The crystal chandelier overhead refracted light into 1,000 fractured rainbows, each shard of brilliance illuminating the lie that was Seraphina Davenport's life. She stood in the center of the Haverford ballroom, her ivory silk gown pristine, her posture impeccable, her smile a masterwork of delicate warmth. To every observer, she was the perfect vision of aristocratic grace, the newly elevated Earl of Davenport's cherished daughter, blessed with beauty, breeding, and an enviable future. Only Seraphina knew she was suffocating. Her father's hand rested lightly on her elbow, a gesture that appeared paternal and protective. The pressure of his fingers, however, told a different story, a subtle warning, a constant reminder of the price of her silence. She had learned to read the language of his touch as expertly as a scholar deciphered ancient texts. 2 fingers, smile more warmly. 3 fingers, someone important approaches. A complete grip. Say nothing, reveal nothing, be nothing but beautiful compliance. "Lord Ashworth is watching you again," her father murmured, his voice honeyed for any eavesdroppers. "Smile at him, Seraphina. He has 20,000 a year." She obeyed, directing her practiced expression toward the aging Earl across the room. Lord Ashworth's returning gaze held an acquisitive hunger that made her skin crawl, but she maintained her composure. She had become extraordinarily skilled at maintaining composure. Viscount Charles Davenport, no, she must remember Earl now, elevated just 3 months prior through means that still made her stomach turn, surveyed the gathering with barely concealed triumph. His new title sat upon him like an ill-fitted coat, too grand for his character, purchased at a cost that would haunt Seraphina for the remainder of her days. She knew precisely what the Tones saw when they looked at her father. A gentleman of moderate fortune who had rendered some unspecified service to the crown, rewarded with elevation and a modest increase to his holdings. A respectable story, a believable fiction. The truth was a contract, signed in her father's study 4 months ago, witnessed by men whose faces she had been forbidden to see. A contract that had exchanged her silence for his advancement, her voice for his vanity, her very soul for his title. "You will remember what we discussed," her father said, his tone pleasant, but his meaning unmistakable. Lord Ashworth would make an excellent match. Expedient, immediate. You understand the importance of expediency, do you not, my dear? Seraphina understood perfectly. The elevation had brought status, but not sufficient funds to maintain it. Her father's gambling debts, his investments in failed ventures, his extravagant attempts to appear wealthier than he was, all of it required fresh capital. A wealthy son-in-law would solve his immediate problems and ensure her continued cooperation. After all, a married woman's silence could be more easily enforced than a daughter's. "I understand, father," she replied, her voice a model of filial obedience. Inside, where no one could see, she was screaming, "My beautiful family." Before we dive into this interesting story, I need to share something important with you. We're on a mission to reach 1,000 subscribers, and right now, there are only limited spots to be among our founding 1,000. Our inner circle who were here from the beginning. And I want you to be among our most cherished first 1,000. These first 1,000 subscribers will always hold a special place in this community. You'll be the ones who believed in these stories when we were just starting out. The ones who helped build something beautiful. But here's the thing. Once we hit that milestone, that opportunity closes forever. You'll still be welcome, but you won't be part of that exclusive founding group who shaped this channel's journey. So if you've been watching without subscribing, now is your moment. Don't let this story end without you being part of our family. And tell me where you are watching from. Now, let's get into the story. The ballroom doors opened with a dramatic sweep, and the master of ceremonies announced in ringing tones, "His Grace, the Duke of Ravenscroft." The effect was immediate and electric. Conversations faltered, heads turned. Even the musicians seemed to play more quietly, as though the very air had been commanded to attend. Seraphina had heard of Damien Blackwood, Duke of Ravenscroft, though she had never before seen him in person. The whispers about him were legion and contradictory. A brilliant investor who had tripled his already considerable fortune. A ruthless negotiator who destroyed business rivals without mercy. A recluse who despised society, yet appeared occasionally like some dark, avenging angel. Some called him the Crown's unofficial auditor, the man who investigated irregularities among the peerage with terrifying efficiency. Others simply called him dangerous. He entered the ballroom with the confidence of a man who owned not merely an estate, but the very ground upon which others walked. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in severe black evening clothes that seemed designed to reject rather than invite approach, he moved through the crowd with predatory grace. His features were striking: sharp cheekbones, a strong jaw, eyes of such penetrating gray they seemed capable of reading ledgers written upon human souls. Those eyes swept the ballroom with methodical precision, cataloging, assessing, calculating. And then they found Seraphina. The impact was physical. She felt the weight of his attention like a hand pressed to her chest, stealing her breath. For a long, impossible moment, the Duke of Ravenscroft looked at her with an intensity that suggested he saw far more than the perfect facade she presented. He saw the fear. Beside her, she felt her father stiffen, his fingers tightening painfully on her elbow, all 5 fingers now, a grip that meant danger, meant silence, meant disappear if possible. "Steady, Seraphina," her father breathed, his voice tight with something she recognized as terror poorly disguised as authority. "Do not engage him. Do not draw his attention." But it was too late for that counsel. The Duke had already begun moving through the crowd, his path as direct and unyielding as justice itself, aimed precisely toward where father and daughter stood. Seraphina's heart hammered against her ribs. She knew, with the instinct of a woman who had learned to sense danger in the subtlest shifts of circumstance, that her carefully maintained prison was about to receive its most formidable assault. The Duke of Ravenscroft was coming for her father, and she, bound by contract and fear, would have to defend the very man who had sold her voice to purchase his vanity. The Duke's approach was inevitable as a gathering storm, and Seraphina felt her father's panic through the trembling of his hand on her arm. Yet when Damien Blackwood finally stood before them, her father's expression had transformed into one of pleasant, if puzzled, welcome. "Your Grace," the newly minted Earl said, executing a bow calculated to show respect without servility. "What an unexpected honor. I was not aware you frequented such gatherings." "I do not," the Duke replied, his voice a low rumble that somehow carried perfect authority without volume. "I make exceptions when circumstances require my personal attention. Lord Davenport, I require a moment of your time. Tonight, if you would be so generous." It was phrased as a request. Every person within earshot understood it as a command. "Of course, Your Grace. Perhaps tomorrow afternoon? I would be delighted to call upon—" "Tonight," the Duke repeated, and this time there was no politeness softening the word. "Lady Haverford has been kind enough to provide use of her late husband's study. The matter is both urgent and delicate." Seraphina watched her father's face cycle through emotions too quickly for society's observation, but plain as text to her trained eye. Fear, calculation, desperate assessment of escape routes that did not exist. "Naturally," her father finally managed. though I confess myself mystified as to what matter could be so pressing. The Duke's gray eyes shifted to Serafina for the first time since reaching them, and she felt the assessment in that gaze like a physician's probe seeking disease. Lady Serafina should attend as well. The discrepancy involves certain household accounts that may benefit from her recollection. Her breath caught. This was unusual, potentially scandalous. Young unmarried ladies did not attend private meetings with powerful men, even in borrowed studies with fathers present. "I hardly think my daughter's presence is necessary," her father began. But the Duke had already turned, clearly expecting them to follow. They had no choice but to comply. The study was oppressively masculine, all dark wood and leather, the scent of old tobacco and older money. The Duke closed the door with a decisive click that made Serafina's pulse jump. Her father positioned himself before the massive desk as though it were a battlement, while she remained near the door, hands clasped, eyes downcast in the perfect attitude of feminine irrelevance. "Now then," her father said with forced joviality, "what is this discrepancy you mentioned?" The Duke did not sit. He stood with his back to the cold fireplace, a position that forced both father and daughter to face him, as though he were magistrate and they the accused. "3 months ago, you received an elevation from Viscount to Earl," the Duke stated, his tone carrying no inflection whatsoever. "The official record indicates this was in recognition of unspecified services to the Crown." "Yes, a great honor, though I confess the nature of the service must remain confidential." "I am aware of what confidentiality typically conceals," the Duke interrupted. "I am also aware that such elevations are generally accompanied by financial grants or land transfers to support the increased dignity of title. According to my examination of the Exchequer records, you received neither." Serafina's fingernails pressed crescents into her palms. He had examined the records. Of course he had. Men like the Duke of Ravenscroft did not make accusations without evidence already in hand. "The Crown's generosity takes many forms, Your Grace. Perhaps the records you consulted were incomplete. They were complete." The Duke's eyes narrowed fractionally, which raises an interesting question. How does a gentleman of your previous financial circumstances I have also thoroughly examined, support the considerable expenses of an earldom? Your accounts show significant debts, investments that have uniformly failed to produce returns, and a household expenditure that outstrips your estate's income by a factor of 3. Her father's face had gone pale beneath his careful grooming, but his voice remained steady. "Your Grace, I must protest this intrusion into my private affairs. By what authority do you conduct such investigations?" "By the authority of someone who finds the mathematics troubling," the Duke replied. "I have a particular distaste for unexplained wealth, Lord Davenport. In my experience, when the sums do not balance, the imbalance is being supported by means that will not withstand scrutiny." This was catastrophic. Serafina recognized the moment as clearly as if a clock had chimed the hour of reckoning. If the Duke continued this investigation, if he pulled at these threads, the entire tapestry of lies would unravel. She had to intervene. "Your Grace," she said softly, stepping forward with the graceful deference she had perfected over months of terror. "Forgive my intrusion into gentlemen's business, but I believe I may provide some clarification." The Duke's attention swiveled to her, and for a moment she nearly faltered beneath the weight of that intelligent, penetrating regard. His eyes were not cruel, she noted with surprise, but they were absolutely uncompromising. "Please," he said, "I welcome clarification." "My father is perhaps too modest to mention his various personal economies," she continued, allowing a gentle smile to touch her lips. "The reduction in household staff, the cancellation of the London season preparations, The sale of my mother's secondary jewels? All prudent measures that have allowed him to maintain dignity without crown subsidy. I have myself taken on management of the household accounts and found numerous areas where my father's previous steward had been wasteful. It was a masterful deflection, she knew. It explained economies without admitting poverty, suggested competence without claiming expertise, and painted her father as prudent rather than desperate. The Duke studied her in silence for 3 heartbeats that felt like 3 hours. "How convenient," he finally said, "that you have taken such comprehensive control of the household finances at precisely the moment your father's elevation occurred." The words were casual. The implication was a blade pressed to her throat. "I wished to be useful," she replied, her voice admirably steady despite the terror coursing through her veins. "Useful," the Duke repeated, and something in his tone suggested he understood that word meant something entirely different from what society would assume. His gaze held hers, and she saw the moment he recognized what she was truly doing, not explaining, but protecting, not clarifying, but concealing. And beneath her careful composure, he saw her fear. "This conversation is far from concluded," the Duke said finally. "I will require a full accounting of your household expenditures, Lord Davenport. All records from the past year. Delivered to my residence within 48 hours. He moved toward the door, then paused beside Seraphina. "Lady Seraphina," he said quietly, for her ears alone, "useful daughters often pay the highest price for their father's ambitions." Then he was gone, leaving her standing in the wreckage of her perfectly constructed lies, wondering how a man she had just met could see the truth she had hidden from all of London. The morning after the interrogation, Seraphina sat in the breakfast room, surrounded by ledgers she had no ability to falsify and accounts that would not bear scrutiny. Her father had departed before dawn, claiming urgent business in the city, a transparent abandonment that left her to manage the crisis he had created. The records the Duke demanded told a story of financial ruin temporarily masked by an inexplicable elevation. They were damning precisely because they were honest. Her father had been too arrogant or too foolish to fabricate more convincing numbers. She had 40 hours remaining to deliver documents that would destroy them both. The solution, when it came to her, was audacious to the point of madness. She would deliver the records herself, not to submit, but to control the narrative. The Duke of Ravenscroft was a man who valued directness, who despised deception. She had seen that clearly in his interrogation. Perhaps honesty, carefully calibrated, could be a more effective weapon than lies. By noon, she stood before the imposing facade of Ravenscroft House in Mayfair, her heart hammering against her stays. The butler who answered her knock regarded her with the perfect blankness of superior servants confronted with irregularity. "Lady Seraphina Davenport to see His Grace," she announced, extending her card with a steady hand that belied her terror. "He is expecting documentation from my father's household." The butler's expression suggested that young ladies did not deliver documentation personally. But he accepted her card and left her standing in an entrance hall of such austere magnificence it seemed designed to intimidate lesser mortals. The Duke appeared with unexpected swiftness, descending the curved staircase with the same predatory grace she remembered from the ball. He had discarded his formal evening attire for working clothes, though on him, even shirt sleeves and a waistcoat carried an air of absolute authority. "Lady Seraphina," he said, and she could not determine if his tone reflected surprise or satisfaction. "I specified that the records be delivered. I did not specify by whom, though I confess I did not anticipate your father would send you." "He did not send me," she replied, meeting his gaze with effort. I came of my own volition. The household accounts are my responsibility, as I mentioned. It seemed appropriate that I deliver them personally and address any questions you might have. Something flickered in those gray eyes. Interest, perhaps, or suspicion. How unconventional, he observed. Also potentially inappropriate. You arrive without chaperone to the residence of an unmarried gentleman. Your reputation suggests you have no interest in compromising young ladies, she replied with calculated boldness. And my reputation will survive 30 minutes in your study discussing ledgers. Unless you intend to damage it deliberately. I do not deal in social destruction, Lady Serafina. Only financial truth. He gestured toward a corridor. My study. Since you have been so obliging as to deliver the records in person, I will accept your offer to address questions. The study was exactly as she had imagined. Austere, organized, dominated by a desk covered in neat stacks of correspondence and calculation. He directed her to a chair and took his own seat behind the desk, a positioning that reminded her uncomfortably of the previous night's interrogation. She placed the ledgers before him with hands that trembled only slightly. He opened the first volume and began reading with the focused intensity of a scholar examining sacred texts. The silence stretched, broken only by the turning of pages and the ticking of an ornate clock. Serafina watched his face, trying to anticipate the moment when he would find the damning patterns. Your household expenditure exceeds income by nearly £4,000 annually, he said without looking up. Yet there is no corresponding debt increase. How is this mathematical impossibility achieved? My father has resources beyond the estate, she replied carefully. Personal investments not reflected in household accounts. I have examined those investments. They are uniformly unprofitable. He looked up, pinning her with that unsettling gaze. You are lying to protect him. The directness was startling. She had expected questions, insinuations, the slow tightening of evidentiary nets. Not this blunt accusation. I am answering your questions truthfully within the scope of my knowledge, she countered. An exquisitely precise evasion. He closed the ledger. Let us abandon the pretense, Lady Serafina. Your father acquired an earldom through means that were neither military service, diplomatic achievement, nor financial contribution to the crown. The elevation was purchased, though not with money. I wish to know the currency of that transaction. Her breath caught. He was too close, too perceptive, too dangerous. Your Grace, I believe you are constructing conspiracy from coincidence. I am constructing truth from evidence, he interrupted. And the evidence suggests your father traded something of considerable value to someone with influence over the peerage appointments. I intend to discover what and with whom. This was the precipice. If she remained silent, he would continue investigating until he uncovered the contract. If she spoke, she would violate the agreement that kept her father from ruin and herself from consequences she could barely contemplate. Why? She asked quietly. Why does this matter to you? My father's elevation harms no one. It is a private arrangement. There are no private arrangements when they corrupt the integrity of the peerage, he said, his voice hardening. I have spent considerable effort rooting out exactly this type of transaction. Men who purchase titles they have not earned, who manipulate systems designed to reward merit, who treat England's honors as commodities to be bartered. They weaken the very foundations of ordered society. And what of the people damaged by your investigations? She demanded, her own composure fracturing slightly. What of the families ruined by your insistence on absolute truth? Does your moral certainty justify every casualty? Something shifted in his expression not softening precisely, but a recognition that surprised her. "You speak as though you would be such a casualty," he observed. "I speak as someone who understands that truth and justice are not always synonymous," she replied, "and that sometimes silence protects the innocent rather than the guilty." He leaned back in his chair, studying her with renewed intensity. "Are you innocent in this matter, Lady Seraphina?" The question hung between them like a blade suspended by thread. "That depends entirely on your definition of innocence," she said finally. "If innocence requires complete ignorance, then no. If it requires willing participation, then yes. There are positions between villain and victim, Your Grace. Some of us occupy them not by choice, but by circumstance." The clock chimed the quarter hour. The Duke's gaze never wavered from her face. "Return home," he said abruptly. "Tell your father I require additional documentation, specifically all correspondence relating to his elevation. He has 1 week." It was both dismissal and reprieve. She rose, managing a curtsy despite her shaking knees. "Your Grace, I ask you to consider the possibility that some secrets protect rather than conceal." "I have considered it," he replied. "I have also considered that those forced to protect such secrets deserve liberation rather than complicity." She left Ravenscroft House uncertain whether she had deflected his investigation or merely confirmed his suspicions. But one thing had become terrifyingly clear. The Duke of Ravenscroft saw her not as her father's accomplice, but as his prisoner. And prisoners, once identified, were either freed or further confined. The Duke of Ravenscroft had not built his reputation on patience, yet he found himself exercising it with uncharacteristic discipline in the matter of Lord Davenport. 3 days had passed since Lady Seraphina's surprising visit to his study, and the requested correspondence had not materialized. This was expected. Guilty men did not willingly provide evidence of their guilt. What was unexpected was his decision to observe the Davenport household directly. He told himself it was investigative thoroughness that brought him to Hyde Park at precisely the hour when the Davenport carriage made its daily circuit. He told himself it was strategic intelligence gathering that led him to position himself near the secluded grove, where the carriage habitually stopped to allow Lady Seraphina her brief constitutional walk. He did not examine too closely why his investigation had begun to center more on the daughter than the father. The carriage arrived on schedule, and Seraphina emerged in a walking dress of pale green that seemed designed to help her disappear among the foliage. Her maid remained by the carriage, a breach of propriety that suggested either negligence or instruction. Seraphina moved along the path with the same practiced grace he had observed at the ball, nodding to passing acquaintances, her expression serene. The Duke maintained his distance, partially concealed by an ancient oak, feeling uncomfortably like a spy, which, he supposed, was precisely what he was. The Earl of Davenport's arrival shattered the peaceful scene. The man appeared on the path ahead of his daughter, clearly having anticipated her route. Even from a distance, Damien could see the tension that transformed Seraphina's posture the moment she recognized her father. Her spine straightened, her hands clasped tightly at her waist, and her face became a mask of careful neutrality. They were too far away for Damien to hear the initial exchange. But the Earl's gestures were emphatic, aggressive. He thrust a folded paper toward his daughter, correspondence perhaps, or a bill of some kind. Seraphina took it with obvious reluctance, read it, and her face went absolutely white. The Duke moved closer, using the landscaping as cover, until their voices became audible. "Cannot possibly expect me to manage this," Seraphina was saying, her voice strained but controlled. "The sum is impossible. I have no access to such funds." "Then you will find access," her father hissed, his veneer of paternal affection completely absent. Do you imagine I have worked this hard to establish our position only to have it collapse because you lack creativity? You mean because I lack the ability to conjure 5,000 pounds from air? Her voice rose slightly, the first crack in her composure. I have economized everywhere possible. I have managed every creditor, delayed every payment, stretched every resource until it screams. There is nothing left to manipulate. Then you will accept Lord Ashworth's proposal when he makes it next week. The words fell like an executioner's blade. Serafina actually stepped backward, as though physically struck. No, she whispered. Father, please. He is 50 years old. He has buried 2 wives already, and his reputation includes 20,000 a year and a willingness to pay handsomely for a young, beautiful wife, her father snapped. Your delicate sensibilities are a luxury we can no longer afford. You will accept him. You will be grateful for the opportunity, and you will remember that your cooperation is not optional. I am not a commodity to be sold. You became precisely that the moment you signed your name to our agreement. The Earl's voice dropped to a vicious whisper. Or have you forgotten the terms? Your silence, your obedience, your complete cooperation in exchange for my discretion. Would you prefer I withdraw that discretion, Serafina? Shall I reveal to all of London exactly what? Stop! The word was barely audible, but it carried such desperate anguish that Damien felt it like a physical blow. Please, I will consider Lord Ashworth's suit. Just please stop. Her father's expression transformed instantly back to paternal satisfaction. There is my sensible daughter. I knew you would see reason. He patted her cheek with false affection. The announcement will be made at the Pemberton Ball next week. Wear the blue silk. Ashworth particularly admired you in blue. He departed as abruptly as he had arrived, leaving Serafina standing alone on the path. For a long moment, she remained absolutely still, her face frozen in that expression of perfect composure. Then, as though her strings had been cut, she stumbled toward a nearby bench and collapsed onto it. Her hands came up to cover her face, and her shoulders began to shake with silent, desperate sobs that she was clearly trying to suppress even in this moment of relative privacy. The Duke of Ravenscroft, who prided himself on objective analysis and emotional detachment, felt something unfamiliar and uncomfortable twist in his chest. This was not the behavior of a co-conspirator. This was not the calculated distress of a woman caught in wrongdoing. This was the breakdown of someone trapped in circumstances beyond her control, forced to defend a man who treated her as property, bound by some agreement that gave her father absolute power over her future. You became precisely that the moment you signed your name to our agreement. She had signed something, some document that compelled her cooperation, that allowed her father to threaten her with exposure, that transformed her into a bargaining piece in his schemes. The Duke stepped forward, abandoning concealment. Serafina heard his footsteps and looked up. Her face still wet with tears she frantically tried to wipe away. When she recognized him, fresh horror flooded her expression. "Your Grace," she gasped, rising unsteadily. "I did not... That is, I was just..." "Sit down before you fall down," he said, more gently than he had intended. When she hesitated, he added, "Please, Lady Serafina, I am not here to judge your moment of private distress." She sank back onto the bench, her hands twisting in her lap. "How long were you observing?" "Long enough," he replied, taking a position standing before her, close enough for private conversation, far enough to preserve some semblance of propriety. "Long enough to understand that I have been investigating the wrong criminal." Her eyes, red-rimmed and desperate, met his. "I don't know what you mean." "I think you know precisely what I mean." He kept his voice quiet but firm. "I have been treating you as your father's accomplice, when you are in fact his victim. The agreement he mentioned, the one that compels your silence and obedience. That is what I should be investigating, is it not?" "You are mistaken," she said automatically, but her voice carried no conviction. "I am many things, Lady Seraphina, but mistaken is rarely among them." He studied her carefully. "What did you sign? What document gives your father such power over you that you would surrender your entire future to protect his secrets?" She looked away, her jaw tight with the effort of maintaining control. Even if such a document existed, discussing it would violate its terms. Terms that include forcing you to marry a man 3 decades your senior, whom you clearly fear. Terms that include many things I find unpleasant, she said quietly. But unpleasant and illegal are not synonymous. My father has broken no laws, Your Grace. Whatever arrangement exists between us is a private family matter. Family matters that involve coercion and threats are my concern when they corrupt public institutions, he countered. Your father obtained his elevation through irregular means. That much is certain. What I am now beginning to understand is that you were the price he paid for it. She stood abruptly, agitation finally breaking through her careful control. You understand nothing. You see patterns and assume corruption, but some transactions are necessary. Some silences protect more than they conceal. I have told you this already. And I told you that those forced to keep such silences deserve liberation, he replied, his voice hardening with determination. I intend to provide it, with or without your cooperation. Terror flashed across her face. Your Grace, I am begging you, cease this investigation. Whatever you think you are saving me from, your interference will only make worse. There are consequences you cannot imagine. Ramifications that would destroy more than just my father's reputation. What consequences, Seraphina? He used her given name deliberately, trying to pierce the formality that kept her defensive. What does he hold over you that inspires such desperate protection? For a moment, he thought she might answer. Her lips parted. Her eyes held his with an intensity that suggested the truth was fighting its way free. Then she turned and walked away, her spine rigid with the effort of maintaining dignity, while her entire world crumbled around her. The Duke watched her go, his investigative instincts now coupled with something far more dangerous, personal investment in her liberation. He would find that document. He would break its hold over her, and he would ensure that the Earl of Davenport paid the full price for treating his daughter as currency. The Duke's private secretary, Mr. Edmund Hartley, was a man of exceptional discretion and even more exceptional investigative capabilities. He had served Damien for 12 years, ever since a fortunate intervention had saved Hartley from debtor's prison and earned the Duke a loyalty that bordered on religious devotion. Where others saw insurmountable bureaucratic obstacles, Hartley saw puzzles waiting to be solved. Which was why, at 3 o'clock on a gray Thursday afternoon, he entered the Duke's study with an expression that managed to communicate both triumph and unease. Your Grace, he said, closing the door with careful precision. I have found something regarding the Davenport elevation, though I confess the discovery raises more questions than it answers. Damien looked up from the correspondence he had been reviewing without actually reading, his mind persistently returning to the image of Seraphina's tears in the park. Show me. Hartley placed a slim folder on the desk. The official record of the Earl of Davenport's elevation lists the reason as services rendered to the Crown of a confidential nature. Standard language for situations where public disclosure would be inappropriate, usually matters of intelligence or diplomatic sensitivity. "I am aware of the official record's vagueness," Damien said with barely concealed impatience. "I need what lies beneath it." "Indeed, Your Grace. Which is why I did not limit my investigation to official channels." Hartley opened the folder to reveal several pages of notes in his precise handwriting. The actual mechanism of peerage elevation requires approval from multiple offices, the Home Secretary, the Lord Chancellor, and ultimately the Crown itself. Each office maintains its own records, not all of which are perfectly synchronized. You found a discrepancy. "I found an addition," Hartley corrected. "In the Lord Chancellor's private files, which required considerable effort and expense to access, there is a notation that does not appear in the public record. Next to Lord Davenport's elevation, someone has written, 'Per agreement of settlement, witnessed and sealed.'" Damien leaned forward, his pulse quickening. "Settlement of what nature?" "That is where the trail becomes deliberately obscure," Hartley said, his frustration evident. "The reference suggests a formal document, legally binding, that formed the basis for the elevation. But there is no copy of such a document in the Lord Chancellor's files, no summary of its terms, and no indication of what was being settled. Who witnessed it? That information is also conspicuously absent. However," Hartley produced another sheet of paper. "I cross-referenced the date of the notation with the Lord Chancellor's appointment diary. On the day in question, he had only 3 scheduled meetings. One with the French ambassador regarding trade agreements, one with a bishop concerning ecclesiastical appointments, and one listed simply as private matter, Davenport concern, 2 witnesses present. No names for the witnesses? None recorded in the diary. But Your Grace, the meeting was scheduled for 2 hours, an unusually long duration for what should have been a straightforward elevation approval. And the notation in the file was added in different ink from the rest of the entry, suggesting it was included after the fact, perhaps as a reminder or precaution." Damien stood and moved to the window, his mind working through the implications. A formal settlement agreement, witnessed and sealed, that somehow secured an elevation without the traditional requirements of service or payment. The unusual duration suggested complex negotiations. The lack of detail in the records suggested deliberate obscurity. "What type of settlement requires such secrecy?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "In my experience, Your Grace, only settlements involving matters that would cause scandal if publicly disclosed," Hartley replied. "Illegitimate children being legitimized, embarrassing family secrets being formally buried, occasionally, information damaging to powerful individuals being guaranteed never to surface. Blackmail, in other words. Officially sanctioned silence, Your Grace. There is a difference, legally speaking." Damien turned back to face his secretary. Lord Davenport possessed information someone powerful wanted suppressed. In exchange for his guaranteed silence, he received an elevation and whatever other considerations the settlement included. "That would be my assessment," Hartley agreed. "Though there is an unusual element. Most such arrangements involve monetary compensation as well. Payment for silence. The Davenport settlement appears to have involved no financial transaction whatsoever. Because the currency was not money," Damien said quietly, the pieces falling into a pattern that made his chest tighten with anger. It was his daughter. Hartley's expression shifted from professional detachment to genuine shock. "Your Grace?" "I observed an interaction between Lord Davenport and Lady Seraphina," Damien explained, his voice hardening. He referenced an agreement she had signed, one that compels her obedience and silence. He is now forcing her toward a marriage she clearly does not desire, using this agreement as leverage. Good God, Hartley breathed. You believe the settlement was a contract selling his daughter's cooperation? I believe Lord Davenport had information that someone wanted buried. Rather than pay him to keep silent, they elevated his title, giving him status, but not the funds to maintain it. To ensure his continued discretion, and perhaps to bind the arrangement more completely, they required a guarantor, someone whose own silence and compliance would ensure he never broke the agreement. His daughter, Hartley finished, his voice tight with distaste. She signed as a guarantor of his silence, pledging her own behavior as surety, which gives whoever holds that contract power over both father and daughter, Damien continued. The father cannot speak without violating the agreement and losing his title. The daughter cannot speak or act against the terms without triggering whatever consequences were specified. They are both trapped. But she bears the greater burden because she is being actively controlled. Hartley was quiet for a moment, his analytical mind clearly processing the full horror of such an arrangement. Your Grace, if such a contract exists, it would be legally binding. Even if you discovered its full terms, you might not be able to break it without the consent of all parties involved. Then I will obtain that consent, Damien said flatly. Or I will find grounds to invalidate the contract entirely. But first, I need to know who holds it. The witnesses, Hartley said, understanding immediately. If we can identify who witnessed the settlement, we can determine who benefits from its enforcement. Can you discover their identities? Hartley considered, his expression thoughtful. The Lord Chancellor is still living. He might be persuaded to disclose the information, though such persuasion would require either leverage or appeal to conscience, neither of which is guaranteed to succeed. Then find me another avenue, Damien ordered. Someone else who was present, or who has knowledge of the arrangement. Someone with less to lose from disclosure. I will make inquiries, Your Grace. Though I must caution that such investigations become dangerous when they involve powerful individuals who have gone to great lengths to ensure secrecy. I am aware of the dangers, Damien replied. Proceed anyway. I want the names of those witnesses within 1 week, and I want any information you can gather about the specific terms of this settlement. Hartley nodded and moved toward the door, then paused. Your Grace, forgive the presumption, but this investigation has become unusually personal for you. The Lady Serafina is a victim of her father's ambition and someone else's manipulation, Damien interrupted sharply. That is all you need to understand, Hartley. Find me that contract. After his secretary departed, Damien returned to the window, watching the gray London afternoon without truly seeing it. Somewhere in this city, there existed a document that had turned a young woman into property, that compelled her silence and obedience, that was now forcing her toward a marriage she feared. He would find it. He would break it. And he would ensure that every man who had profited from Serafina's imprisonment paid the full measure of justice. The investigation was no longer merely about corruption in the peerage. It had become something far more urgent, a rescue. The decision to break into Lord Davenport's study was not one Damien made lightly. He had built his reputation on working within the law, on using legitimate channels to expose corruption. But legitimate channels moved slowly, and Serafina did not have the luxury of time. The Pemberton ball was in 3 days, and with it, the public announcement of her engagement to Lord Ashworth. 3 days to find evidence that could free her from whatever agreement bound her. 3 days to commit what was, technically, a criminal act in service of a greater justice. He chose a moonless Thursday night when the Davenports were attending Lady Worthington's musicale, an event whose interminable length was legendary among the ton. Hartley had confirmed their attendance and estimated they would not return before midnight. That gave Damien approximately 3 hours. He had refused Hartley's offer to accompany him. If this venture ended in disaster, only one of them needed to be implicated. The Davenport townhouse was modest by aristocratic standards, a narrow building in a respectable but not fashionable square. The staff would be minimal, a skeleton crew left behind while the family attended evening engagements. Damien approached from the mews, dressed in dark clothing that would not reflect lamplight, his lockpicks concealed in his coat. The servant's entrance yielded to his tools with embarrassing ease. Lord Davenport apparently economized on quality locks, as he did on everything else. Inside, the house was quiet, save for the distant sounds of kitchen activity. Damien moved through the darkened corridors with careful precision, using the architectural plans Hartley had procured to navigate toward the study on the first floor. He encountered no one. The servants were occupied with their own dinner, and no one expected an intruder in this unremarkable household. The study door was locked, but again, not seriously. Damien was inside within 30 seconds, closing the door silently behind him and allowing his eyes to adjust to the deeper darkness. Thick curtains covered the windows, preventing him from lighting a lamp without risk of external observation. He produced a small hooded candle instead, its meager light sufficient for reading but unlikely to be noticed from the street. The room was a monument to pretension, expensive furniture that looked recently purchased, leather-bound books arranged by size rather than subject. A portrait of the Earl in his new robes that dominated one wall with aggressive pride. Damien ignored the performative displays and focused on the desk. The drawers were locked with slightly better mechanisms than the doors, suggesting Lord Davenport understood that his real vulnerabilities lay in his paperwork. It took Damien nearly 10 minutes to work through all of them, his fingers beginning to ache from the delicate manipulation. The first 3 drawers yielded exactly what he expected: bills both paid and overdue, correspondence with creditors containing increasingly desperate promises, investment documents for ventures that had uniformly failed. The financial picture they painted was dire. A man living far beyond his means, drowning in debt, sustained only by his title and the hope of a wealthy son-in-law. The 4th drawer was different. It was deeper than the others, and it contained a locked metal box of the type used to store valuable documents. The lock was superior quality, German-made, the kind that serious men used for serious secrets. Damien felt his pulse quicken as he worked at it, knowing he was close to something significant. The lock surrendered with a soft click that seemed thunderous in the silent room. Inside the box lay perhaps a dozen papers, arranged in careful order. Damien lifted them out, bringing the candle closer. The first document was a letter from the Lord Chancellor's office, dated 4 months prior, confirming the elevation of Charles Davenport, Viscount, to the dignity of Earl. Standard bureaucratic language, notable only for what it did not mention: no reason for the elevation, no conditions, no ceremony details. The second document made his breath catch. It was a formal contract, written in the precise legal language of official agreements, signed and sealed with multiple signatures and wax impressions. The heading read, "Agreement of Perpetual Silence and Surety, entered into this 15th day of March, 1824. Damien forced himself to read slowly, comprehensively, though rage built in his chest with every line. Whereas the party of the first part, Charles Davenport, Viscount, possesses information of a sensitive nature regarding certain activities and associations of persons highly placed in government and society. And whereas the disclosure of said information would cause significant damage to reputations, positions, and the orderly conduct of state business, and whereas the parties desire to reach a permanent arrangement ensuring said information remains undisclosed in perpetuity, it is hereby agreed. First, that Charles Davenport shall be elevated from Viscount to Earl, with all attendant rights and privileges. Second, that Charles Davenport shall never, under any circumstances, disclose the information described in the sealed addendum to this agreement, upon penalty of immediate revocation of title and criminal prosecution for violations of the Official Secrets Act. Third, and of critical importance, that to ensure the absolute reliability of this silence, Charles Davenport's daughter, Miss Seraphina Davenport, aged 19 years, shall serve as guarantor and surety of her father's compliance. Damien's hand tightened on the paper, crumpling its edge. Miss Seraphina Davenport hereby pledges her complete silence regarding all matters known to her father, her absolute obedience to directives provided by the designated administrators of this agreement, and her cooperation in any and all measures deemed necessary to maintain the security of the sealed information. Miss Seraphina Davenport further acknowledges that any violation of these terms by herself or her father will result in the immediate public disclosure of information catastrophically damaging to her personal reputation and future prospects, the specific nature of which is detailed in Sealed Addendum B. Miss Seraphina Davenport enters into this agreement of her own free will, understanding that it is binding for the duration of her natural life, and that no subsequent marriage, change of circumstance, or appeal to authority can void its terms. The signatures followed. Charles Davenport's ostentatious scrawl, and beneath it, in a smaller, more delicate hand that trembled slightly in its formation, Seraphina Davenport. 2 witnesses had signed as well. Damien recognized both names immediately: Lord Pemberton, the Home Secretary, and Sir Richard Ashworth, Permanent Secretary to the Treasury. Men of immense power and influence. The same Ashworth family that was now pursuing Seraphina's hand in marriage. The pieces fell into a pattern so corrupt, so calculated, that even Damien's experienced cynicism was shaken. They had not merely silenced the father and controlled the daughter. They had engineered a situation where Seraphina would be married into the very family administering her contract, ensuring permanent, intimate control over her compliance. A separate page listed the directives she was bound to obey. They were comprehensive and devastating. She could not refuse any marriage proposal approved by the administrators. She could not leave England without permission. She could not correspond privately with anyone not approved by her father. She could not seek legal counsel or discuss the agreement with any third party. She was, in every meaningful sense, a slave. The sealed Addendum B was not in the box, presumably locked away somewhere even more secure, its contents held over her like a perpetual sword. Damien carefully photographed each page using the small camera Hartley had procured for exactly this purpose, a new American device that could capture documents by candlelight. His hands shook with rage as he worked, making the process more difficult than it should have been. When he had recorded everything, he returned the documents to their precise positions, relocked the box, relocked the drawers, and departed the study exactly as he had found it. He left the Davenport house with evidence of a crime so profound it made a mockery of every principle he believed in. They had purchased a title with a young woman's freedom. They had transformed a daughter into property through legal mechanisms designed to protect contracts, not people. And they had done it with her signature, obtained God only knew how, through threats, through lies, through whatever leverage her father and these powerful men had used to convince a 19-year-old girl that she had no choice but to sell herself into perpetual bondage. By the time Damien reached his own residence, His fury had crystallized into absolute determination. He would break this contract. He would expose every man who had profited from it. And he would ensure that Seraphina Davenport never again lived under another person's control. The law might consider the agreement binding. But Damien had never allowed legal technicalities to prevent him from achieving justice. He would find a way, and heaven help anyone who stood in his path. The note that arrived at the Davenport residence the following morning was brief and impossible to refuse. Lady Seraphina, I have information of vital importance to your situation. Meet me at the Ravenscroft House Library at 2 o'clock this afternoon. Come alone. This concerns your freedom. Ravenscroft. Seraphina stood in her room, the paper trembling in her hands, terror and desperate hope warring in her chest. He knew something. The Duke's message made that clear. But what did he know, and what would he demand in exchange for his silence? She told her father she was visiting the lending library with her maid, a lie that came easily after months of practiced deception. She dismissed the maid at a bookshop with instructions to wait, then proceeded alone to Mayfair, her heart hammering against her stays with each step. The butler admitted her without comment, as though young ladies regularly visited the Duke unchaperoned for matters of vital importance. He led her to a library of breathtaking scale, walls lined floor to ceiling with books, tall windows letting in the gray afternoon light, and a massive oak table in the center where the Duke stood waiting. On that table lay a single document. Even from the doorway, Seraphina recognized it. The precise legal script, the official seals, the signatures at the bottom. Her vision swam, and she grasped the doorframe for support. Please sit down, the Duke said quietly, gesturing to a chair positioned across from the document. I know this is a shock. How did you? Her voice failed. She tried again. That is my father's private. I obtained it through means I will not detail, he interrupted. The legality of my acquisition is irrelevant compared to the illegality of the document itself. She forced herself to move forward, to sit in the offered chair, though every instinct screamed at her to flee. The contract lay between them, like a serpent coiled to strike. Your Grace, whatever you think you understand. I understand that you are a prisoner, he said, his voice carrying a controlled fury that was somehow more frightening than shouting would have been. I understand that your father and two powerful members of government conspired to sell your freedom in exchange for a title. I understand that you have been living under the threat of this document for 4 months, unable to speak, unable to refuse any directive, unable to seek help. Tears burned in her eyes, but she blinked them back. You have no right to interfere in private family matters. This ceased to be a private family matter the moment it involved corruption of the peerage and what amounts to indentured servitude, he countered. He sat down across from her, his gray eyes holding hers with uncomfortable intensity. Seraphina, I am not here to judge you or expose you. I am here to help you. You cannot help me, she whispered. The contract is legally binding. I signed it of my own. She could not complete the lie. Of your own free will? He finished for her. That is what the document claims. I do not believe it for a moment. What did they threaten you with? What did they tell you would happen if you refused? The question broke something inside her. 4 months of silence, of terror, of carrying this impossible burden alone. It all came flooding to the surface with a force she could not contain. They told me my father would hang, she said, her voice breaking. They told me he had committed treason by obtaining information about illegal arms sales to foreign powers. They showed me evidence, documents in his handwriting, correspondence that implicated him in espionage. They said he would be tried convicted and executed unless I signed. The Duke's expression darkened. Go on. Lord Pemberton and Sir Richard came to our house in the middle of the night, she continued, the words tumbling out now that the dam had broken. My father was drunk, terrified, babbling about having found something he should not have seen. They interrogated him for hours while I listened outside the study. And then they called me in. She stared at the contract, remembering that night with crystalline clarity. They were very calm, very reasonable. They explained that my father had indeed discovered evidence of criminal activity, but that exposing it would destabilize the government at a critical time. They said prosecution was one option, or we could reach an arrangement. An arrangement that required your signature, the Duke said quietly. They said my father could not be trusted to maintain silence on his own, that he was weak, given to drink and gambling, likely to confess or attempt blackmail if left to his own devices. They needed a guarantor, someone whose compliance would ensure his. She looked up, meeting the Duke's gaze. They told me I was saving his life, that this was the only way to protect him from the consequences of his own stupidity. And the sealed addendum? The Duke asked. The information they hold over you personally? Fresh shame flooded her face. A fabrication, but a convincing one. Explain. She drew a shaking breath. Before that night, I had been corresponding with a young gentleman, the second son of a baron. Someone my father would never have approved because he had no fortune. The correspondence was innocent, but it was secret, and it was improper. Somehow they knew about it. They told me they had evidence suggesting the relationship had progressed far beyond correspondence. Letters they claimed to have intercepted that contained compromising details. Did such letters exist? No. The word came out vehemently. I never wrote anything of that nature. But they had samples of my handwriting, and they showed me what could be fabricated with enough skill. Documents that looked authentic, that would destroy my reputation utterly if made public. They said the choice was simple. Sign the agreement and the fabricated evidence would never surface, or refuse and watch both my father hang and my own name dragged through such scandal that I would never recover. The Duke was silent for a long moment, his jaw tight with barely controlled rage. How old were you? 19. I had just completed my first season. Did you have anyone to advise you? A solicitor, a trusted relative? They gave me 15 minutes to decide, she said bitterly. My father was weeping, begging me to save him. Lord Pemberton was very kind, very understanding. He told me it was a formality, that I would barely notice the restrictions, that it was simply insurance against my father's indiscretion. Her laugh was hollow. I believed him, or rather, I had no choice but to believe him, because the alternative was watching my father die. So you signed. So I signed. She looked at her hands, remembering how the pen had shaken, how the ink had blotted where her tears had fallen on the page. And for the first month, it seemed almost bearable. The restrictions were mostly things I would have done anyway. Maintain silence about my father's discovery. Avoid drawing attention to our family. But then, the directives began. The marriage to Ashworth. Among other things. Small commands at first: wear this dress, attend this function, smile at this gentleman. Then larger ones. Cut ties with certain friends. Dismiss my longtime maid and accept a replacement they provided. And finally, the arrangement with Lord Ashworth's son, Sir Richard's nephew, conveniently positioned to monitor me for the rest of my life. The Duke stood and moved to the window, his back rigid with fury. "This is not a contract, Serafina. It is slavery dressed in legal language." "It is binding nonetheless," she said hopelessly. "I consulted legal texts in secret. Contracts entered into under duress can be challenged, but proving duress requires evidence and witnesses I do not have. And even if I could prove it, the scandal of the attempt would destroy what remains of my reputation. The administrators would release their fabricated evidence, and I would be ruined anyway." "Not if I destroy them first," the Duke said quietly, turning to face her. Hope and terror warred in her chest. "Your Grace, these are powerful men. Lord Pemberton controls the Home Office. Sir Richard has influence over half the financial mechanisms of government. They have protected this secret with extraordinary care. If you move against them without absolute proof—" "I have proof," he interrupted. "I have this contract, which is evidence of conspiracy and corruption. I have documentation of your father's financial situation, proving the elevation was not earned. I have resources and influence of my own that make Pemberton and Ashworth look like petty bureaucrats playing at power." "But you obtained the contract illegally," she protested. "It cannot be used as evidence." A cold smile touched his lips. "Evidence for a court of law? No. But evidence for the court of public opinion? For private conversations with the Prime Minister, who takes a very dim view of his ministers engaging in extortion? For strategic application of pressure until these men have no choice but to void this agreement and withdraw from public life entirely?" Serafina stared at him, hardly daring to believe what he was suggesting. "You would do that? Risk your own position, your reputation, to free me from this?" He crossed the room and knelt before her chair, taking her trembling hands in his. The gesture was so unexpected, so intimate, that she caught her breath. "Serafina, I have spent my entire adult life fighting corruption and injustice. I have exposed financial fraud, ended careers, dismantled schemes that cost honest people their livelihoods. But I have never encountered something as fundamentally wrong as this." His gray eyes held hers with fierce conviction. "You are not property. You are not a guarantor or a commodity or a strategic asset. You are a woman who was manipulated into signing away her freedom by men who should have protected you instead of exploiting you." "I thought I was protecting my father," she whispered. "You were protecting him. You still are, at enormous cost to yourself. But that obligation ends now." He squeezed her hands gently. "Trust me, Serafina. Let me fight this battle for you. Let me give you back your voice." She looked into his face, seeing for the first time not the cold, calculating investigator who had terrified her, but a man of absolute integrity offering her something she had believed lost forever: hope. "What do you need from me?" she asked. "The truth. All of it. Everything you know about what your father discovered, about how Pemberton and Ashworth coerced you, about every directive they have given since. I need it documented, witnessed, prepared for the moment when I bring their empire of silence crashing down." Serafina took a shaking breath, and for the first time in 4 months, she began to speak freely. The Pemberton Ball was the pinnacle of the London season, attended by everyone of consequence and many who merely aspired to consequence. The ballroom glittered with 1,000 candles reflected in gilt mirrors, and the cream of society swirled across polished floors in a carefully choreographed display of wealth and status. Serafina stood near the refreshment tables in her required blue silk gown, feeling like a condemned prisoner awaiting execution. Her father hovered nearby, his expression oscillating between triumph and anxiety. Lord Ashworth and his son, the Honorable Thomas Ashworth, her intended bridegroom, flanked them like sentries, ensuring she could not escape. Thomas Ashworth was 53 years old, corpulent, and possessed of wandering hands that had already found her waist twice during their brief conversation. His breath carried the scent of wine and something more unpleasant, and his eyes assessed her with the calculating gaze of a man inspecting livestock. "You look lovely this evening, my dear," he said, moving closer than propriety allowed. "Blue suits you admirably. I shall enjoy seeing you wear the Ashworth sapphires." "You are too kind, Mr. Ashworth," she replied automatically, the words ash in her mouth. "Not Mr. for much longer," her father interjected with forced joviality. "The announcement is scheduled for 10 o'clock. Lord Pemberton himself will make the declaration. Quite an honor." It was not an honor. It was a public shackling, carefully orchestrated to ensure she could not withdraw without creating a scandal that would destroy what remained of her reputation. Once the engagement was announced before 500 witnesses, refusal would be impossible. She had 1 hour of freedom remaining. The Duke of Ravenscroft had promised he would act before the announcement. She had not seen him since their meeting 3 days ago, had received no word, no assurance that his plan was proceeding. Terror gnawed at her that he had reconsidered, or that Pemberton had discovered his investigation and neutralized him somehow. "There is Lord Pemberton now," her father said, his voice tight with poorly concealed anxiety. "Come, Seraphina. He wishes a private word before the public announcement." She followed her father toward the library where Lord Pemberton waited, Thomas Ashworth trailing behind them like a proprietary shadow. The crowd parted for them, curious eyes tracking their progress. Everyone knew an important announcement was imminent. The rumor mill had ensured that much. The library was smaller than the ballroom, but no less grand, lined with leather-bound volumes that Lord Pemberton almost certainly never read. The Home Secretary stood near the fireplace, his expression genial and utterly false. "Ah, Lord Davenport, Lady Seraphina, young Thomas," he said warmly. "How delightful you all look this evening. Are we prepared for our little announcement?" "Quite prepared, my lord," her father said obsequiously. "My daughter is honored by the Ashworth family's regard." "Indeed." Pemberton's gaze fixed on Seraphina with an intensity that reminded her forcefully of the night she had signed the contract. "And Lady Seraphina understands, I trust, the importance of this alliance? The necessity of her enthusiastic acceptance?" It was a threat dressed as a question. Seraphina forced herself to meet his eyes. "I understand the terms of our arrangement, my lord." "Excellent. Then when the announcement is made, you will smile, you will blush appropriately, and you will accept young Thomas's proposal with every appearance of maidenly joy. Any deviation from this script would be most unfortunate." The door opened before she could respond, and Sir Richard Ashworth entered, Thomas's uncle and co-architect of her imprisonment. "The ballroom is prepared. Shall we proceed?" "One moment," Pemberton said, withdrawing a folded paper from his coat. "Lady Seraphina, I require your signature on this document, merely a formality confirming your willing acceptance of the match. Standard procedure for arranged alliances of this significance." Seraphina took the paper with numb fingers, recognizing it for what it was, another chain, another legal mechanism to ensure her compliance. Once she signed this, even the Duke's intervention might come too late. She unfolded the document slowly, stalling for time she did not have. The words blurred before her eyes as panic rose in her throat. "Seraphina," her father hissed quietly. "Sign it, now." She lifted the pen, her hand trembling so violently she could barely hold it. The library door burst open with a crash that made everyone jump. The Duke of Ravenscroft stood in the entrance, his expression as cold and implacable as divine judgment. Behind him stood two men, Seraphina recognized as crown solicitors, and behind them several members of the Privy Council. "I would not sign that document if I were you, Lady Seraphina," the Duke said, his voice carrying absolute authority. Pemberton's face flushed with fury. "Ravenscroft, this is a private family matter. You have no business." "I have every business when the matter involves criminal conspiracy, extortion, and the corruption of the peerage," the Duke interrupted. He advanced into the room, and the officials followed, effectively blocking the exits. "Gentlemen, Lady Seraphina, I apologize for the dramatic interruption, but circumstances require immediate action." "This is outrageous," Sir Richard sputtered. "Lord Pemberton, as Home Secretary, I demand you have this man removed." "Lord Pemberton is in no position to demand anything," one of the Privy Council members said coldly. "Your Grace, please proceed." The Duke reached into his coat and withdrew a document that made Seraphina's heart stop. The contract. He held it up so everyone in the room could see the official seals. "This," the Duke announced, "is a contract entered into 4 months ago between Lord Pemberton, Sir Richard Ashworth, and the Earl of Davenport. Its terms are as follows. In exchange for elevation from Viscount to Earl, Lord Davenport agreed to permanent silence regarding criminal activities he had discovered. To ensure his compliance, his daughter was coerced into signing as guarantor, pledging her absolute obedience to directives from the administrators, Pemberton and Ashworth." "That is privileged information," Pemberton shouted. "Sealed by official decree. Sealed to hide corruption, not to protect national security," the Duke countered. "I have spent the past 3 days presenting this evidence to the Prime Minister, the Lord Chancellor, and members of the Privy Council. The investigation into the activities Lord Davenport discovered has been reopened under proper authority. It confirms illegal arms sales to French interests with profits distributed among several highly placed officials." He turned to face the room's occupants with devastating precision. "Lord Pemberton and Sir Richard Ashworth used their positions to cover their crimes by silencing the one man who had discovered them. Rather than face justice, they elevated him to ensure his complicity and imprisoned his daughter to guarantee his silence. This contract represents not merely corruption, but a fundamental perversion of justice." Sir Richard had gone white as parchment. Thomas Ashworth looked between his uncle and the Duke with dawning horror. Seraphina's father seemed to have aged a decade in 30 seconds. "The Prime Minister has already accepted Lord Pemberton's resignation," the Duke continued relentlessly. "Sir Richard's resignation from Treasury will be tendered tomorrow. Both men will face formal inquiry for their role in the arms sales and the extortion of Lady Seraphina. The Earl of Davenport will also face consequences, though his cooperation in providing testimony may mitigate his sentence." "Cooperation?" her father whispered. "But You will testify fully regarding the criminal activities you discovered and the means by which Pemberton and Ashworth coerced your daughter's signature," the Duke said flatly. "In exchange, you will avoid prosecution for your own minor role in the conspiracy. You will, however, forfeit your elevation. The earldom was obtained through fraud and will be revoked." One of the Crown solicitors stepped forward, addressing Seraphina directly. "Lady Seraphina, the contract you signed has been reviewed by the Lord Chancellor and deemed void on grounds of coercion and duress. You are released from all obligations detailed therein, effective immediately. The sealed materials held as leverage against you have been destroyed without examination, by order of the Privy Council." The words seemed to come from very far away. Void, released, free. "This is persecution," Pemberton blustered one final time. "Ravenscroft has conducted illegal searches, stolen private documents. The Prime Minister has granted full immunity for any irregular methods employed in uncovering this conspiracy," the Privy Council member said coldly. "Your crimes are far more serious than procedural violations, Pemberton. I suggest you save your protests for the formal inquiry." The Duke crossed the room to stand before Serafina, his gray eyes searching her face. "Are you all right?" She nodded, unable to speak, barely able to breathe. 4 months of terror, of silence, of imprisonment, ended in a matter of minutes. "Your Grace," she finally managed. "The ballroom. Everyone is waiting for the announcement." A slight smile touched his lips. "Then let us give them one they will not forget." He offered his arm. She took it, feeling strength flow from him to her trembling frame, and together they walked from the library back into the ballroom. The crowd fell silent as the Duke led her to the center of the floor. 500 pairs of eyes watched with avid curiosity. "Ladies and gentlemen," the Duke's voice carried to every corner of the vast room, "I have the honor to announce that there will be no engagement between Lady Serafina Davenport and Mr. Thomas Ashworth. Instead, I would like to formally declare my own intentions toward this extraordinary woman, should she be willing to consider them." The ballroom erupted in shocked whispers. Serafina looked up at him, tears streaming down her face, and for the first time in 4 months, she smiled with genuine joy. "I am willing, Your Grace," she said clearly, her voice carrying across the sudden hush. "I am very willing indeed." 3 weeks had passed since the Pemberton ball, and London society still vibrated with scandal. Lord Pemberton and Sir Richard Ashworth had been formally charged with corruption and arms trafficking. The trials were expected to be sensational. The Earl of Davenport, no longer an earl, merely Charles Davenport once more, had retreated to a modest property in Yorkshire, his title revoked, his reputation destroyed, his testimony secured in exchange for avoiding prison. Serafina had not seen her father since that night. She found she did not miss him. She stood now in the Ravenscroft House drawing room, a space that had become more familiar to her than her own former residence. The Duke had insisted she take up residence in the guest wing immediately following the revelation, chaperoned by his formidable aunt, the Dowager Duchess of Ravenscroft, who had arrived from the country with remarkable speed and declared Serafina a sensible gel who deserves better than she's been given. It was the first time in Serafina's life that she had felt truly safe. The drawing room door opened and Damien entered, still dressed in his riding clothes from his morning exercise. His severe features softened when he saw her, a transformation she was beginning to recognize as uniquely hers to witness. "You are awake early," he observed, crossing to where she stood by the windows, overlooking the garden. "I thought you were finally beginning to sleep properly." "I am," she assured him. "But I woke with energy rather than anxiety. It is a novel sensation." He smiled, that rare expression that transformed his face from formidable to something approaching gentle. "I am glad to hear it, though I confess I have been waiting for the right moment to discuss a matter of some importance." Her heart quickened, though not with the fear that would have accompanied such words a month ago. "That sounds ominous, Your Grace." "Damien," he corrected, as he had been doing for weeks. "And it is not ominous, merely significant." He took her hand, his touch warm and steady. "Serafina, when I announced my intentions at the ball, I did so primarily to protect you from further speculation and to establish publicly that you were under my protection." "I know," she said quietly. It was strategic, not romantic. I have not presumed otherwise. You should have, he interrupted gently. Because while the announcement was strategic, the sentiment behind it was entirely genuine. She looked up at him, hardly daring to hope. I have spent 3 weeks watching you emerge from the prison your father and those men constructed around you, he continued. I have watched you rediscover your voice, your opinions, your ability to laugh without calculation. I have watched you become fully yourself. And Serafina, the woman you are, is extraordinary. Damien. Let me finish, he said, a hint of his usual commanding tone entering his voice. I am not a man given to romantic declarations. I am difficult, demanding, and inclined to see the world in terms of problems requiring solutions. I work too much, I trust too little, and I have been told on numerous occasions that I am impossibly cold. You are not cold, she protested. You are principled. You are perhaps the only person in England who would characterize my nature so generously. His gray eyes held hers with absolute sincerity. But with you, I find I am different. Less cold, perhaps. Or at least, cold in service of warmth, your freedom, your happiness. He drew a small box from his pocket and opened it to reveal a ring of breathtaking simplicity, a single perfect diamond set in platinum, elegant and unadorned. I am asking you to marry me, Serafina. Not because society expects it after my public declaration. Not because you require protection, though I will always provide it. I am asking because I have fallen quite desperately in love with you. And I cannot imagine my life without your voice in it. Tears blurred her vision. But they were tears of joy so profound, it threatened to overwhelm her. You love me? I love you, he confirmed. Your courage, your integrity, your refusal to be broken by circumstances that would have destroyed someone with less strength. I love your mind and your spirit, and the way you challenge me to be better than my coldest instincts. I love you, and I am asking you to choose me, not because you have no other options, but because you want to. I do want to, she said, her voice breaking with emotion. I love you, Damien. You gave me back my freedom, and now I choose freely to spend my life with you. He slipped the ring onto her finger with hands that trembled slightly, the first sign of nervousness she had ever seen him display. Then he drew her into his arms and kissed her with a tenderness that made her understand that beneath his formidable exterior lived a man capable of profound feeling. When they finally parted, both breathless, she laughed with pure delight. The Duke of Ravenscroft, undone by sentiment. Who would believe it? No one, he replied, a smile playing at his lips. Which is why we shall maintain my reputation for cold calculation in public while I worship you shamelessly in private. I find those terms acceptable. He kissed her again, and she melted into the embrace, marveling at how completely her life had transformed. 4 months ago, she had been a prisoner. Now she was cherished, protected, and free to love and be loved in return. The wedding took place 6 weeks later in the Ravenscroft family chapel, a modest affair attended only by close friends and family. Serafina wore cream silk and carried roses from the Ravenscroft gardens. The Dowager Duchess wept openly. Damien's hand trembled as he placed the wedding band beside her engagement ring. When the vicar pronounced them married, Serafina felt chains she had not even fully recognized finally fall away. The wedding breakfast was held at Ravenscroft House, and it was there, surrounded by people who genuinely cared for her happiness, that Seraphina discovered the true extent of her liberation. Lord Ashford, one of Damien's oldest friends, was holding forth on some political matter when he made a claim about naval appropriations that Seraphina knew to be incorrect. "Forgive me, Lord Ashford," she said, her voice clear and confident, "but I believe those figures are outdated. The appropriations were revised in the last parliamentary session." The table fell silent. Not the hostile silence of disapproval, but the attentive silence of people interested in what she had to say. "Are you certain?" Lord Ashford asked, genuinely curious rather than dismissive. "Quite certain. I read the parliamentary reports. The naval budget was increased by 15% to account for new shipbuilding initiatives." "By God, she is right," another guest confirmed, consulting his own memory. "I had forgotten the revision." Damien's hand found hers under the table, squeezing gently. When she looked at him, his eyes shone with pride and something deeper. The recognition that she was finally, fully herself. The conversation moved on, but Seraphina sat in wonder, realizing what had just occurred. She had contradicted a peer of the realm on a matter of fact. She had spoken her knowledge confidently, and rather than being silenced or punished, she had been heard and acknowledged. This was what freedom felt like. Later that night, in the private sanctuary of the Duchess's chambers at Ravenscroft, her chambers now, she reminded herself with wonder, Damien found her standing by the window, looking out over the moonlit grounds. "What are you thinking?" he asked, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "I am thinking that I spent 4 months believing my voice was dangerous," she said quietly. "That speaking would bring ruin and disaster. And now, I am married to a man who values my voice above everything." "Not above everything," he corrected gently. "I value your happiness above all. Your voice is simply one essential component of that happiness." She turned in his arms to face him. "Do you know what the worst part of that contract was? Not the restrictions or the threats. It was the silence. Being forced to swallow every thought, every opinion, every objection. Becoming a beautiful, empty vessel with nothing inside but fear." "You were never empty," he said fiercely. "They tried to silence you, but they could not erase who you are. Your strength, your intelligence, your essential self, all of that survived their attempts to destroy it." "Because you saw it," she replied, touching his face with gentle fingers. "You looked at me and saw past the facade to the prisoner beneath. No one else did." "Then everyone else is a fool." He kissed her softly. "And you, my brilliant wife, are free. Free to speak, to argue, to contradict even me when you believe I am wrong, which you will undoubtedly do with great frequency." She laughed, the sound bright and unrestrained. "I absolutely will. I have months of suppressed opinions to express." "I am counting on it," he said, and she heard in his voice the absolute truth of it. He wanted her voice, her thoughts, her unfiltered self. She had traded her devastating silence for liberating love. She had survived her father's betrayal and emerged not broken, but stronger. And she had found, in the most unexpected place, a partnership built on mutual respect and genuine affection. "I love you," she said, the words still novel enough to feel like a miracle. "I love you," he replied. "And I promise you, Seraphina, that for the rest of our lives, you will never again fear the sound of your own voice." She kissed him then, pouring into that kiss all the gratitude, all the love, all the hope for their future together. Outside, London slept, unaware that in one grand house in Mayfair, A woman who had been sold into silence had finally found her voice again. And she would never, ever be silent again. My sweet family, Serafina found her voice. But here's what haunts me. Hundreds of thousands of you just watched her entire journey, witnessed her transformation from prisoner to free woman, felt every moment of her pain and triumph. And you're about to scroll away without subscribing. You'll close this video, and tomorrow you won't remember the channel name. Next week, when I post a story that might be even more powerful than this one, you won't see it. You'll miss it completely. And that breaks my heart because you clearly love these stories. You watched all the way to the end. So why would you gamble on never finding your way back here? Subscribe right now. It takes 1 second. Like this video so others can find Serafina's story too. Share it with someone who needs to remember that voices stolen can be reclaimed, that silence can be broken, that love can be liberating. Don't let this be the last story we experience together. I'll see you in the next one, but only if you subscribe. Don't disappear on me. At the end of this video, you'll see a suggestion for another powerful story from our channel. Click it and let yourself be surprised by even more unforgettable emotions with love. The Victorian Royals Stories team.